to recall that the history of a theological movement is not just the history of ideas as such, but also necessarily the history of the institutions which are the necessary crucible and platform for those ideas. Scholars need time and resources in which to think and in which to produce their more serious works. We think of Imam al-Ghazali and the Nizamiya and other institutions that gave them the space in which to accomplish that extraordinary output. So I'm going to say a few words about as an initiative, still, I suppose, a small one in the shadow of the University of Cambridge, but not formally part of it, with which I've had the pleasure to be associated for the past several years. The Cambridge Muslim College, I know some of you know Cambridge. Cambridge is a town that has a long tradition of association with people from this part of the world. And essentially the purpose of it is to serve the new and growing, but still only partially well-led leadership of the British Muslim community that in many ways finds itself torn between two worlds, at the front line of the East-West impact zone, subject to not only the usual traumas, difficulties, challenges, possibilities of migrant communities in an often doubtful, if not hostile, host society, but also finds itself carrying many of the psychic tensions, burdens, aspirations of the larger ummah. Not an easy psychic place for Muslims to be. So this is just a brief summary of the demographics, which actually are quite startling, as in many Muslim communities there is rapid growth. And the most recent census figures of 2011, which have now been crunched and processed, and do give a sense of religious affiliation, indicate that quite startlingly, that despite the closure of primary immigration to the UK and progressive attempts by governments over the last 20 years or more to clamp down on immigration, refugees, asylum claims, that the Muslim population in England between 2001 and 2011 actually grew by 60%. This is something that was quite startling to many of us, and is projected to grow until we're looking at probably a topping out of the Muslim population of Britain within a couple of decades at around 20% of the national population. And also, the second paragraph there indicates that not only is it a matter of quantity, but also a matter of quality. For reasons which we don't have time to go into, the rate of retention of religiosity across the generations is much higher in Muslim communities than it is in other religious communities in the UK. And in some sectors there's evidence that amongst the young there's stronger sense of religious rather than purely cultural affiliation than the older generation. The census report also indicates that there's probably about 100,000 converts to Islam in the United Kingdom, which means that about 1 in 600 people in Britain now is a convert to Islam. And again, as the communities intermingle, it seems likely that that number will increase as well. So a minority, still a small minority, less than 5%, but one with very significant growth horizons and, of course, cultural and religious needs. Just a few, for those of you who are not familiar with our community, things that surfaced in a very extensive piece of research that came out 6 or 7 years ago, which indicates that on the usual indices of citizenship and a sense of belongingness, British Muslims actually tend to score higher than the national average. This was startling to a lot of people in the tabloid press, and even to the community as a whole. Generally speaking, British Muslims tend to feel that they are more part of the British national project than do British Christians or most other sections of Britain's religious landscape. So despite sort of outrages such as the one which we saw unfolding in London yesterday, that's a margin, but the bulk of the community generally does feel very much a part of the host society. The flip side of this is that the community is in many ways challenged economically, challenged socially. There are educational challenges as well. Muslim underperformance in the schools, which tends to fluctuate a lot depending on the ethnic group. People of Bangladeshi heritage do a lot better than people of Punjabi heritage. Muslims of African heritage often do less well than Muslims of Turkish heritage. So it's not easy to say that there's a single Muslim pattern for educational achievement in the UK. But there are high achievements. So last week I was at the annual conference of the British Islamic Medical Association. They estimate there's about 7,000 Muslim doctors now working in the British Health Service, and a number that continues to grow. So that at the top end of the spectrum, there are some high flyers, but there's also this pattern of underachievement as well, leading criminalisation. In terms of the religious leadership, this figure of 1,800 mosques is a kind of guesstimate, really, because defining a mosque exactly, what is a masjid, what is a surah, what is a place where people only pray Jummah, it's a matter of definition. 1,800 may be a valid kind of figure. The first generation did struggle mightily in order to create an infrastructure of mosques for the new community. The next generation's challenge is to look at the message that is coming from the minbar of those mosques, which of course is a much more difficult task. It is generally the case that the imams of the mosque in England are born outside the United Kingdom, and in very many cases, although it's not possible to offer a statistic, they may not have English as their mother tongue. The khutbahs may be in Arabic, with an explanation in Urdu or in Bengali, and very much the culture is directed to people of the older generation of migrants from the subcontinent with their specific culture, whether it be Bangladeshi, Mirpuri, Punjabi, Pashtun, or Arab, or Turkish, or Kurdish, or Albanian, or whatever. Very diverse community. So this is already recognised as a problem. But there's new leadership roles emerging because of the very extensive chaplaincy sector. So even the British government employs around about 300 Muslim chaplains in various capacities, such as prison chaplaincy, armed forces chaplaincy, Royal Air Force, and so forth. And that presents a different career path for advancement for Muslims who are looking for pastoral and leadership roles outside the existing mosque framework, where generally, for somebody who's slightly outside a particular paradigmatic way of viewing the Ummah and the world, finds it very difficult to get appointed by the very conservative older generation, which tends to control mosque appointments in most sectors in British Islam. So chaplaincy very significant now. University chaplaincy is very important. Hospital chaplaincy also very significant. And one of the things we've had to think about at the Cambridge Muslim College is what exactly is this idea of chaplaincy? Does it have a precedent in the Islamic tradition? Is it like the Shaykh al-Riwaq, who used to be an important figure in Al-Azhar and other traditional cognate fields? But we have to recognise that in the plural, complex society of Britain, it's not just mosque leadership or madrasa leadership, but there are these other sectors as well, where people can sometimes rise to positions of real influence. And of course, another side of that is that religious leadership can happen amongst women in the context of chaplaincy. Whereas in mosque leadership, normally it doesn't or can't. So the basic infrastructure of Islamic training in the UK is concentrated in these institutions known as Darul Uloom, which are very much a product of the North Indian Mughal and late Mughal intellectual elite heritage, based on the Firangi Mahal curriculum, which emerges from Lucknow and other centres of northern India in the 17th and the 18th century. Classical Hanafi curriculum originally focusing on the ma'qul, but with the passage of time focusing particularly on the manqul sciences. In fact, one of the things we have to consider in our context serving these institutions is the problem that over the last 50 years in the curricula of the great madrasas of the subcontinent, there has been a progressive shift away from the ma'qul and towards the manqul, away from things like logic and kalam and some of the rhetoric sciences, towards an emphasis very much on fiqh and hadith, partly in order to push back against the growing Salafi and Ahl al-Hadith movements, but also to do with the general sense in the Ummah that the ma'qul represents something that somehow isn't going to serve us. So in modern Britain, where everything is ma'qul, and in Cambridge, which is the city of science, and Darwin, and Stephen Hawking, and Newton, we find that most of the trainee imams have not studied the ma'qulat very much, but focused very much on the manqul. So one of the things that we have to remedy is the absence of a strong kalam or theological training, which is regrettable. The division into the Deobandi and Brelvi traditions, which some of you will be familiar with. At Cambridge Muslim College, we take students from any denomination. 90% of them have been either Deobandi or Brelvi. And despite the disputes that exist amongst them in the subcontinent and some sections of their diaspora, generally speaking, we've had no problems of fellowship or association between Deobandi and Brelvi students in our institution. So these are some of the feeder institutions. So we have 30 big madrasas, boarding schools, some of them with higher education attached, producing maybe 800 or 900 trained ulama every year in the United Kingdom. So there's many more people being trained as imams than being trained as Christian priests now in England. That just reflects the new demography. In many British inner city areas, Islam is by far the most active religion. And in many cases, this is, of course, part of the broader European reality. In Paris recently, I saw a stray statistic that indicates that 60% of people who pray regularly in Paris are actually Muslims. And certainly this is the case in British cities as well. Even where the Muslims are demographically a minority, they are very likely to be a majority of religious people. The last census we had in England, also we saw that for the first time, most people in England do not consider themselves to be Christian. So while the Muslim community grows, Christianity is actually suffering a very steep and even drastic decline. So here are various other institutions which are feeders for ourselves. This is one that has supplied a very large number of applicants to Cambridge Muslim College. We have a very close relationship with it. It's a fairly traditional Deobandi madrasa in the north of England with quite a large student cohort, and they've actually produced many of our graduates. Sorry about the formatting at the top. This is just a compatibility issue. This is the largest female madrasa in the UK, Jami'at al-Kawthar. As you can see, a rather sort of Harry Potterish type of architecture. It was actually a mental hospital before being turned into this enormous centre for ladies in niqab. And they all tell us that there are definitely ghosts in this building. They hear things at night and see things. A rather uncanny kind of place. But they produce some actually very lively young ladies, because Cambridge Muslim College recruits female as well as male students. This is another one. This is the nearest Darul Uloom to London. We've also been there, and they're aware of what we do. Another Deobandi establishment. Jami'at al-Karam, which is in Retford, which is the East Midlands, is the largest, most significant Brelvi Darul Uloom in the UK, and they've supplied maybe a quarter of our applicants to date. Very strong traditional Naqshbandi and Chishti Sufi institution with a boarding school, girls as well as boys, experiencing some difficulties at the moment, but an important centre for actually some of our best, most lively and open-minded students. Here's another one that has supplied us with applicants, Sufat al-Islam, which is a very traditional Sufi type of madrasa in the town of Bradford in West Yorkshire, and so on. So the Darul Uloom curriculum, I mentioned briefly the origins and the history of this. There was a focus very much on Mutun, memorization of Mutun, and particularly on the Hadith. They have been pushed by government, which is a bit uncertain to know what to do with these graduates, in the direction of accommodating the national curriculum. To some extent, that's a matter of statutory requirement, particularly for school-age children. And they have struggled with, on the one hand, their impulse to remain quite a distinct and even insular community that sees itself as defending the values of subcontinental Muslims in the UK against assimilation. And on the other hand, the need not to seem to be promoters of separatism. And for many of the leaders, particularly those whose English is not very good, this has been a rather challenging environment to deal with. But generally they are increasingly incorporating the national curriculum, and in some cases they produce very good results. Some of the schools in the UK that have the very best scores at GCSE and A-level are actually Muslim schools. So some of the Muslim schools are amongst the worst schools, but some of them are also amongst the best. And it's also the case, for instance, in a town in the north of England, near Preston, where the local education authority actually asked the Muslim school to take over some local non-Muslim schools, which were failing, because the Muslim school had such a good administrative record, and indeed they did manage to turn those schools around. So the real issue that is confronting everybody is whether these very insular institutions, where most of the teaching is still in Urdu, are actually producing leaders who are capable of mediating between the reality of modern Britain and the young people who are increasingly engaging with the reality of modern Britain and the traditions of Islam, and particularly the traditions which have their roots in the subcontinent. And generally the ulama, as well as ordinary Muslims and young Muslims and khutbah listeners and mosque goers, are not happy with the existing discourse that they're hearing from the minbar. Even those who are trained locally in the UK just do not really understand the issues that are confronting the young. And that's one reason why we have substantial problems of drug use in the Muslim community, criminalisation, radicalisation, because the message on the minbar just is not on the frequency that young people are equipped to understand. So there's a general sense. And when I talk to the directors of the Darul Ulooms in the UK, they do recognise that they're not really providing a message that really deals with the issues that the young are encountering, but they simply don't know how to change. So the idea of the Cambridge Muslim College is to try and produce a kind of bridge institution between these two different worlds, the actual needs of the Ummah in the UK and the capacity of the older generation of the ulama to deliver the traditional curriculum. So Cambridge seemed a logical place for this, and for more than 10 years we have been holding these conversations with various educational and theological experts in Cambridge. I guess it was 2004 when the idea first was discussed by people in the university, mostly theologians and people who are aware of how the very complex landscape of Cambridge with the university and various institutions that are associated or approved institutions of the university exist in relationship with it, and also the very large number of institutions that are benefiting from the critical intellectual mass of the city of Cambridge, the libraries and so forth, but are not actually formally affiliated with the university. So the first question was, do we want to be part of the University of Cambridge or not? Cambridge, the university, is quite possibly the best in the world. Certainly for the natural sciences, almost certainly they're the best in the world. And the humanities, not far behind. The theology department regularly scores very highly in the research assessment exercise. Obviously, it's sensible to put such an institution in Cambridge rather than in a big Muslim concentration like Bradford or Manchester or London, because in Cambridge we can draw on intellectual resources that are more or less on tap. And so this has been our philosophy. Also, Islamic studies, historically in Cambridge, is well developed. There's a big infrastructure of institutions, some of which I haven't even mentioned here. There's a lot of Islam-related scholarship going on inside the University of Cambridge and in the institutions which are associated with it, and also the manuscript collection at the University Library, very early Quran fragments, Ottoman tafsirs, and the print literature in various Islamic languages and in English. One of the great collections in the world. An obvious place to go if you want to do serious research. So this thing has a mind of its own. So Palmer, Grenville, Brown, Nicholson, the translator of Rumi, some of the great mediators of Islamic culture into Western languages have lived and worked in Cambridge. It's always had this bridge building role. Despite the limitations of the traditional Orientalist paradigm, it has helped to build understanding. So another factor is that Muslim elites for the last 100 years or so, possibly more, have often fetched up in Cambridge as a place where they acquire their professional skills and also their general orientation. So you can see Abdal Yusuf Ali was an undergraduate, studied law at St. John's College, and his translation of the Quran for many Muslims is the best that's ever existed. Tunku Abdurrahman from here was, I think, at St. Catherine's College in Cambridge. Iqbal, the one who had the idea for a place called Pakistan, dreamt of the idea in Trinity Great Court. It's an important place for the Ummah, strangely. The elites very often have had this formative relationship with the city of Cambridge, and the list goes on and on. So Pakistan, this is Chaudhry Rahmat Ali, who lived in Cambridge, actually buried in Cambridge. He has a kind of mazar in Cherry Hinton Cemetery in Cambridge. He was the one who thought of the idea, the name of Pakistan, and the idea of the partition of India. The map that he devised was a rather strange and ambitious one. But it's an example of how new ideas that have a big impact on the intellectual life and also the map of the Ummah can actually happen as a result of people theorising from the ivory towers. So Cambridge is the university, but it also has a kind of archipelago of theological colleges which have a complex relationship to the university centre, partly because of the complex history of the Reformation in the United Kingdom. There are two Anglican colleges which are, in a sense, independent, but in a sense not independent. It's rather like the divine attributes in Kalam. They're not the essence, but they're not other than the essence. You have to live in Cambridge for 500 years to understand exactly what they are. Ridley is one of the big training colleges for the Church of England, and Westcott House is the other. So Anglican priests have been trained in Cambridge for centuries, one of the centres of the English Reformation. And some of their degrees are validated by bits of the university. Wesley House is a centre for training Methodist ministers. Westminster College for the United Reformed Church, which is now a kind of mixture of the Congregationists and the Presbyterians. They're called the United Reformed Church. This is a Catholic institute for Catholic women, Lady Margaret Beaufort Institute. Orthodox Christians have their own place. Centre for Orthodox Christian Studies, a lot of Greeks and Russians fetch up there. This is the Wolf Institute, which is still under construction, but this is a CGI of what it'll look like, which is a centre for interfaith and particularly for Christian-Jewish relations, but they've also run a master's programme in Jewish-Muslim relations as well. So they're also important people to be in partnership with. Tyndale House, which is more evangelical, biblical studies. So there's a lot of religious bits of the university and institutions which are close to the university but not quite part of it. So we had to think in terms of what they were and how they understood the place of a religious institution in relation to a secular university. Faculty of Divinity also has an interfaith program. It attracts Muslim students as well as Christian students. We have 3 years of Quranic Arabic. We have 2 undergraduate programs in Islamic studies. We have PhD students in Islamic studies. And again, a centre for national and international excellence in Islamic studies, but not part of the Faculty of Oriental Studies. It's in Divinity. Another thing we have to think about when we imagine where do you do Kalam in a modern university is it's not a Faculty of Oriental Studies, but perhaps a Faculty of Theology, or perhaps a Faculty of the History of Philosophy, or if you have one, or perhaps a Faculty of Divinity or Theology. It's an interesting question as to exactly where Kalam, as an active tradition that takes religious truth claims seriously, rather than just writing books about Razi or whatever, the way that Orientalists do, where you actually put that in a modern university. And the different European countries have accommodated this in quite disparate ways. So, for instance, the Austrian government's just opened a new Faculty of Theology in Vienna, specifically to be different from the Orientalist faculty, a place where Muslims can be trained and can teach each other. The German government has spent a vast sum on creating 5 new faculties of Islamic theology, and similar initiatives are happening elsewhere in Europe. In England, the government hasn't done that, partly because of financial constraints, and partly because we have a different kind of religious history, and the Church of England, which is kind of part of the state, has its own endowments and awqaf, which tend to be the basis for such institutions, plus dues from the church. So the state doesn't get involved in the promotion of theology as such, the way, say, the German government does. German universities will often have a faculty of Protestant theology and a faculty of Catholic theology, which are paid for by the taxpayer. In England, we simply don't have that model. So creating Islamic studies as an insider discourse in Britain can't really expect some sort of state support, particularly in the context, of course, of reduced budget for higher education and the ongoing credit crunch. So Muslim College seemed to be a very interesting idea. You already have a town with all of these different religious bits, the Anglican colleges, the Catholics, the Orthodox, the Jewish thing. It was kind of a no-brainer to have something for Muslims as well. And generally the university very interested and positive about this. We had meetings with the Vice-Chancellor of the university about what sort of relationship this place should have with the university. Should it be part of the university at all? If so, what will be the degree of control over appointments? The university tends only to brand institutions that it fully controls, obviously for reputational and academic reasons. So if we were to be part of the university, we would not be able to control in any kind of reliable way the kind of people that we were able to appoint. And that clearly would be problematic if you're trying to deliver Islamic education. So generally the consensus was create something outside the university and then come back to us in 300 years or so and see how you've done, and we'll take the conversation further. That tends to be the pace of things in Cambridge, maybe wisely. So the discussion generally was in favour of not having it as part of the university or a degree accredited by the university, but something independent. So various discussions, and creating the curriculum was, in a sense, the biggest task, bigger even than fundraising. How on earth do you produce a course or courses in Cambridge using the best resources available that is also Islamically faithful? So here we found ourselves up against the great issue of the time, the East-West divide, tradition and modernity, reason, revelation, all of that had to be dealt with in quite a systematic and coherent way before we could design our curriculum. So we spent a year working on the curriculum, and the intention was eventually to move into a building of our own, but property is ridiculously expensive in Cambridge. For the first 3 or 4 years we were renting from the Catholic institution, the Margaret Beaufort Institute, which had a separate building, which they let us use for the first few years of our existence. And then we were able to buy this 4 or 5 years ago now, which is our main campus. This is one of our buildings, which is a mid-19th century vicarage, which has permission for educational use. And there's another building adjacent to it, just to the left, and it's in a good location in Cambridge. It's halfway between the main university zone and the railway station. It has its own parking, and we were actually really fortunate to get this. It took several years to find a building that was suitable, and this has actually proved to be very suitable. And because academics, of course, have big egos, to be in a prestigious-looking building is actually rather important in terms of your credibility in Cambridge. If you're in a remote new suburb in a modern building or a porter cabin, even if you're doing first-rate academic work, people won't really want to visit you very often. You won't be mentioned respectfully at the high table at one of the colleges. So ego comes into it, and looking credible is actually indispensable. So alhamdulillah, we were able to buy this. It was about £3 million for the campus, and we've been in it ever since. So as well as teaching, we also have a research division which is important to us. Some would say the most important thing that we do. And we have a series of research projects. This has been one of the projects that we've had, Curriculum for Cohesion, led by Matthew Wilkinson, who's a British Muslim who actually studied at Divinity in Cambridge. And this is a project which has provided 2 new modules on the history of Islam and science for the British National History curriculum, so that those modules are available to every school in England, so that kids can learn about the Muslim contribution to science. So this was done in close cooperation, obviously, with the Department of Education, and had its promoters in Parliament. We had several meetings in Parliament in order to push this idea that Muslims should be allowed to design something that's part of the national curriculum, which is politically sensitive, but obviously has a certain justice to it. So these significant parliamentarians were our champions, and this helped to get us known in official circles. The Cambridge Muslim College is a major professional type of institution. Unlike a lot of rather amateurish Muslim initiatives, this is something that can deliver an academic product that can be slotted into the British national curriculum at the highest level, with teaching materials, with a proper pedagogic theory, with teacher notes and so forth, and it's up and running. So this is the new national curriculum for history, which we were able to make the deadline, and it was indeed incorporated with our 2 modules. These are some of the funders for the Curriculum for Cohesion project, which is now no longer part of the college. It delivered this research project and the pedagogic product, and we've now shut it down. Here are some of our, if you'll excuse the lack of capitalisation, some of the research fellows who we've had in the past. Joel Hayward, who's a British Muslim, has been in and out of the newspapers, spent some time with us. Significant in that he's perhaps Britain's best known expert in war studies. He has the definitive history of the Stalingrad airlift and things like that. So a former professor of strategic air power at King's College, dean of the RAF College, and he came to us, and he's still working on his book on the Maghazi, the campaign to the Holy Prophet, alayhi salatu wasalam, seen through the optic of contemporary theories of just war. A very interesting project. So he was one person who worked with us. Fawzia Bora, also a historian of education, working on Mamluk madrasas. And one of the nice things of taking these postdocs and these early career researchers is that it provides an important point for them to stop, to write up their doctoral work, and then to apply for jobs in the academic mainstream. So after spending a year with us, Dr. Bora applied successfully for a post in Islamic Studies at the University of Leeds. So we provide a kind of facilitation role as well. Mansour Ali, as well, from a traditional Deobandi Darul Uloom background, came to us and found it useful to spend a year in his postdoctoral period of academic development in order to write up his dissertation, and he's now gone on to get a post at University of Wales, and he's co-authored a book on Muslim chaplaincy recently. Abdurrahman Manjera, who's one of the most significant, some would say the most significant of the younger generation of Deobandi scholars in the UK. He has a lot of activity in fatwa, interested in traditional Hanafi text, also a significant publisher of books in English, translations into English of works of significance to the Deobandi community. And he spent a year with us, and actually this was useful for him as well, because he was able to be exposed to some of the philosophers. He came with us on an annual trip to Rome, and he said it was really a useful way of helping him to see how his Islamic training related to the reality of British society. Our former principal, Michael Burdine, Mohammed Asad, has now finished his book on Sir Mark Sykes and the Balfour Declaration. He's a historian, British imperial historian, who came to us from the University of Arizona, and is actually still a non-stipendiary fellow at the college, still in the Cambridge area. Ibrahim Harvey, more recently an expert on the Quran, and has a book with Edinburgh University Press pending on the concept of justice in the Quran, and he does work a lot on Kalam issues, as you can see, particularly in the Maturidi tradition, which is his own specialization. Harith bin Ramli, half Malaysian, many of you will know him, who spent a year with us and is still helping out with teaching in my program at the University of Cambridge, a very active young scholar who again is quite strong on Kalam issues as well as Tasawwuf. So we aim to have a kind of critical mass of good scholars to create an intellectual environment in the college, so
at lunchtime, and when we have visiting speakers, there is a high-level Islamic conversation to be had. Most recently, our current research fellows work on the interface between science and religion. And these are funded by the US-based Templeton Foundation, who are also supporters of Kalam Research and Media. And they've been good partners. And the model that we have is to choose high-level Muslim scientists, to bring them to Cambridge Muslim College for a year, and to train them up in some of the theological disciplines, which maybe, as scientists, they're not particularly strong on. So Asim came to us from UCL with a very high-flying PhD on number set theory, and is working on cosmology, string theory, the Kalam implications of the cosmological arguments about the origin and the nature of the physical universe, and is arranging a specialized conference this summer on theology and cosmology. John Maybury is our other current full-time research fellow, who is a gastroenterologist, convert to Islam at the University of Leicester, and a consultant. He's published over 200 papers in peer-reviewed journals. He's a very serious and senior medical researcher, and his particular area of interest at CMC is on the medical and clinical impact of the habit of regular prayer, which is something that the National Health Service is particularly interested in, because they know that religiosity has quite significant positive health outcomes. And he's one of the world's leaders on this. The diploma program is where we take the graduates of the Darul Ulooms, and occasionally others who have an agenda of wanting to serve the British Muslim community, but haven't studied in the Darul Ulooms, but have a good Sharia background. Many of them are Hafiz, but it's not a precondition. And they come to us for 1 year, having been very carefully selected for intelligence, open-mindedness, flexibility, intellectual curiosity, to do a 1 year, very intensive, full-time diploma in contextual Islamic studies and leadership. And this is to enable them to go back into their communities, whether it be into chaplaincy roles, or back into teaching in the Darul Ulooms, or to running mosques, with a better sense of how to apply their traditional ulum in the modern British context. So these are the numbers, not quite up to date, but recent numbers have been roughly in keeping with this. We interview them quite rigorously. We exclude a lot of people even before the interview stage. We set them a little exam. We want to make sure that we really choose the best applicants, and females as well as male. So it's not a model of mass education. We choose a very small number, and it creates a very intense hothouse environment of these young people for a year. And essentially it's, outside evaluators have come to talk to us, it's basically a 2-year program that we've squeezed into just 1 year. Science and religion is one of the things that we expose them to. At the Darul Ulooms, they don't do the Big Bang, they don't do string theory, they don't do Darwin, they don't do artificial intelligence, any of those things that religionists have to have an informed opinion on. We expose them to these things by bringing in top scientists from the university to explain to them directly. Now, our pedagogic agenda is not to say this particular theory is the correct Islamic way of understanding these issues. Instead, we say, here are the issues. This is neo-Darwinism. This is the modern scientific challenge to neo-Darwinism, and you work it out for yourselves. At the diploma level, we don't take a view on what the correct Islamic response to these scientific challenges should be. We are an open space and simply broaden their horizons. So these are some of the other courses that we have as part of the diploma. An inculturation in the humanities as they are relevant to educated faith leaders in the United Kingdom, so that they feel some kind of membership of the wider constitutional and cultural reality, so that they know the ideas that have shaped the society in which they live. The philosophy program perhaps is the most popular of these, and we have some very good teachers in that, but also English literature, world history, history of the Islamic world, are very important things, because very often we find Muslims just don't know their own history, let alone the history of the countries in which they're living in the West. More practical skills, understanding the British Muslim community, the divisions, the appointment procedures for leadership, the fatwa processes, the Sharia councils and tribunals. This is looking around. Yeah, so counselling and dispute resolution, not just in a marriage context, but in some other context related to the Muslim community. This is important. Pastoral skills, how to deal with young people who have relationship problems, addiction problems, parent problems, identity problems, faith problems. We teach them how to do that. How to manage a mosque administratively, how to file accounts, how to deal with the charity commission, procedural matters. And these sort of religious things that we do, engaging quite often with some of the Christian theologians in the city of Cambridge who are often very happy to help us out. A lot of field trips. We take them every week to see some new place and to engage with new people. This is the Lady Chapel at Ely Cathedral, quite close to us. This is a visit to BBC Radio Cambridge there, so they can see how the media works. This is our annual program at the Vatican. We stay in a monastery, we meet the Pope, we do all of the sites of Rome, but also have interfaith experiences with people at the Gregorium and the Angelicum, which are two of the main pontifical universities there. And it's a very important part of their learning experience. It's an obligatory part of the program. And a problem, incidentally, in that in Italy now, although the Vatican is a great area, the niqab is illegal. So when our girls join the program, we have to say, are you willing to remove the niqab on the 4 or 5 day Italian program? And if they're not, then they can't apply. And this has been an issue on a number of occasions, unfortunately. So the graduates, we have quite a cohort of them now who've gone out into the British Muslim community. Some of them are not very active yet. Some of them are actually significant leaders of mosques and chaplaincy communities. So here's a few of our graduates who we're staying in touch with. Ghulam Mohyeddin, who was at Jamiat al-Karam and also went on to Al-Azhar, is running a very successful mosque in the Manchester area, really injecting it with tremendous dynamism, lots of programs for young people. Zakia is now the first Muslim chaplain at a major National Health Service hospital in London. And one of the things we have to train them in is how to deal with chaplaincy situations in a multi-faith environment. So Zakia is on duty as the duty chaplain in the hospital when a Christian or a Zoroastrian is dying and they ask to see a chaplain. It'll be her duty to go and see that non-Muslim and to talk to them and to find something to say with them. Again, really a new situation for the Ummah, but in a multi-faith society, we have to adopt these multiple roles. And she's been extremely good, very popular in the hospital. Sohaira, one of the things that our graduates can aspire to is joining the academic mainstream. So last year, for instance, 5 of our graduates were accepted to do masters at SOAS in London, where they have a high opinion of our graduates and generally are only too happy to get them. Sohaira was a graduate of our first cohort and then went on to do a PhD in Sharia at the University of California in Santa Barbara, and she's recently landed a job as a lecturer, basically in Islamic law, although it's billed as a theology post, at Georgetown University's campus in Doha, and the education city there. So another thing that this opens up for young ulama is the possibility of academic jobs in the mainstream, which are usually not accessible to people who have a traditional alimiya background. Aqil, another one, from Ibrahim College, which is in London, which we're quite closely partnered with, and he's gone back into the Darul Ulum to kind of be a leaven within the dough and lighten it up. A series of public lectures. Here's Bruno Guidardoni, who many of you will know as a leading French Muslim thinker of the Islam science engagement. He's an astrophysicist at the French National Observatory in Lyon. I should speed up a bit now. Development. Yeah, where now we have launched a full-time 4-year degree in Islamic studies, as well as the diploma, as well as the research fellows. We have this BA, which uses a traditional Syrian-type Mahad al-Fath curriculum, but with quite a strong emphasis on the Ma'qul sciences. Everything taught in English, and engaging as much as we can with intellectual realities which are around us in Cambridge. To do this, we've had to expand. So this is our plan for constructing a new building. You can see Qibla oriented, with a big prayer room, a library, courtyard, and that would provide space probably for about 100 students on the site. This is all land that we already own. This is a building we bought a couple of years ago. We're still fundraising to pay back the loan, but very useful open plan office space that can be used academically as well. So in terms of the finances, the Waqf situation, obviously it's a charity. It's not making money. The diploma students and the BA students are subsidised. If they can pay fees, we ask them to pay fees, but generally, given our economic realities, most of them, including some of the most gifted applicants, simply haven't got the financial resources. So it is expensive. It costs about £500,000 a year to keep us going. And so we have been very actively fundraising. We hope to have a Waqf endowment of around 30 or 40 million pounds in future, inshallah, which would, the dividend on which would keep us going, inshallah, in perpetuity. And that's it. So thanks for your attention. And if anybody's got any questions, I guess we've got 5 minutes or so. Some of this may be relevant to the Malaysian context, and I had a meeting with Dr. Mahathir a few years ago, who was very keen to bring this into the Malaysian context. Other countries as well. We have a partnership now with the Islamic University of Moscow, and we're developing summer schools for some of their ulama at our college. The Bruneians are very interested. Bruneian ministers had come to visit us. Oman also. It's not just in England, but generally in the Ummah that we find that people want to see a higher level of discourse amongst Muslim leaders and an awareness of science issues, of the maqul, of the philosophical challenges of modernity, so that the ulama can really make sense the way they ought to. So, alhamdulillah, we're hoping to develop partnerships in this part of the world, but also throughout the Ummah, inshallah. We're quite small, but we've got pretty mighty ambitions, bi-iznillah ta'ala.